My beloved child, something about this moment is quieter than you expected, and that is exactly why you need to notice it. The truth surrounding your soulmate and their ex is not arriving with noise or drama. It is arriving through the small details that no longer fit together, the hesitation before a name is mentioned, the conversation that suddenly changes direction, the message that was almost explained and then carefully avoided. And somewhere inside all of this, the person from your soulmate's past has become deeply uncomfortable with one possibility, that you may finally understand what was really happening behind the scenes. Don't skip, because what they are hoping you never discover is not simply another secret about the past. It is something that could completely change the way you interpret your soulmate's behavior toward you. For a long time, you may have wondered why certain things seemed harder than they needed to be. Why warmth could suddenly become distance. Why someone who appeared certain about you could become strangely hesitant. Why the connection seemed strongest just before confusion entered the picture. Perhaps you quietly questioned whether you had misunderstood everything. But there is another side to this story, and it begins with something your soulmate's ex understood before you did. Your presence created a contrast that was impossible to ignore. Not because you were competing with anyone. Not because you needed to prove yourself. Simply because being around you made your soulmate notice how differently they felt. There are realizations people can postpone when life stays familiar. Then someone new walks into their world, and suddenly the old explanations no longer feel convincing. That is where the tension began. Your soulmate was not immediately ready to admit it. At first, they tried to treat their feelings for you like something temporary. They told themselves they were simply curious. They tried to remain emotionally neutral. They may even have created distance because they believed distance would make everything simpler. But something kept returning. A memory of your voice. A conversation that felt unusually honest. The way you notice things about them without forcing them to explain every detail. The strange peace they felt after talking to you, even when nothing dramatic had happened. And slowly, your soulmate's ex began noticing the change too. Here is where the story becomes more personal. The ex was not necessarily reacting to something you had done. In fact, you may have had very little involvement in what was happening between them. What disturbed them was the shift they could see in your soulmate. Someone who once accepted certain patterns was beginning to question them. Someone who used to avoid difficult conversations was beginning to speak more openly. Someone who once looked backward was suddenly imagining what life might feel like moving forward. And without intending to, you had become connected to that new possibility. Stay till the end, because there is one detail about this shift that your soulmate never told you, and when it finally surfaced, even they were surprised by what it revealed. There was a moment. Small enough that almost everyone else would have missed it, when your soulmate's ex asked a question about you. It sounded casual at first. Maybe your name had appeared naturally in conversation. Maybe someone else mentioned you. Maybe your soulmate reacted slightly differently than usual. Whatever caused it, the ex noticed. And instead of asking directly how your soulmate felt, they asked something more subtle. Why do you talk differently when that person comes up? Your soulmate tried to brush it aside. They changed the subject. They gave an ordinary explanation. But the question stayed with them. Because somewhere inside, they knew the ex had noticed something they were still trying not to name. Have you ever felt that someone was holding back something important, not because they wanted to deceive you, but because admitting it would force them to make a choice? That may explain more of your experience than you realize. Your soulmate's silence was not always emptiness. Sometimes it was hesitation. Sometimes it was confusion. Sometimes it was someone standing between what felt familiar and what suddenly felt meaningful. And the ex knew that if your soulmate ever stopped avoiding that realization, the entire emotional landscape could change. That is why the energy around you became complicated. Not because there was something wrong with you. Not because you needed to chase an explanation. But because your presence was quietly revealing something your soulmate had not yet learned how to say aloud. Something important is waiting for you, and it begins with a conversation your soulmate believed would remain private. One evening, after another discussion in which your name had somehow entered the room again, the ex finally stopped pretending it did not matter. They asked your soulmate a direct question. Not whether you were attractive. Not whether you had been messaging. Not whether something obvious had happened. The question went deeper. They asked, what is it about them that you cannot forget? And for several seconds, your soulmate apparently had no answer. But that silence said more than an explanation could have. Because if there had been nothing meaningful there, the answer would have been easy. Instead, your soulmate began thinking about moments they had been carefully placing into separate boxes. The first time you made them laugh when they had been carrying something heavy emotionally, the moment you remembered a detail everyone else overlooked, the way they felt understood around you without feeling examined. Individually, those moments seemed harmless. Together, they told a different story. This is the part the ex did not want reaching you. Your soulmate eventually admitted that what unsettled them most about you was not intensity. It was comfort. You did not make them feel like they needed to become someone else to be accepted. And once they recognized that feeling, it became difficult to return to pretending everything was exactly as it had been before. Think about that carefully. Sometimes the connection that changes a person is not the loudest one. It is the one that quietly shows them what peace feels like. And when someone has lived around emotional uncertainty for a long time, peace can feel unfamiliar enough to frighten them at first. So your soulmate stepped backward. They questioned themselves. They may have sent mixed signals. And from your side, it could have looked like rejection or indifference. But behind that behavior was a much more complicated realization. Getting closer to you meant becoming honest about what they truly wanted. Don't skip this next part, because this is where the ex's request for you not to know begins to make sense. The ex understood that you were missing one crucial piece of information. You believed your soulmate's hesitation meant their feelings were weak. The ex knew the opposite possibility had been discussed privately, that the feelings had become significant enough to create questions your soulmate could no longer ignore. That difference changes the entire perspective. Yet there is something important to remember. This is not a story about winning against someone from the past. It is not about proving that one person matters and another does not. Real emotional growth rarely works that way. This is about your soulmate recognizing what kind of connection allows them to become more honest, more peaceful, and more themselves. And strangely, that is what made your name so difficult for the ex to hear. You represented a direction. A possibility. A version of the future that had not existed in the same way before. But the ex had one advantage. they knew your soulmate's history. They knew what made them hesitate. They knew which doubts could make them retreat. And at one point, they used that familiarity to ask your soulmate whether they were sure about you. That question seems harmless. Yet it planted enough uncertainty that your soulmate began overthinking everything. What if they were moving too quickly emotionally? What if you did not feel the same? What if they misunderstood the connection? What if stepping forward changed something they could not restore? And just like that, someone who had been moving closer began becoming cautious. You felt the change, didn't you? Perhaps you could not explain it, but you noticed the atmosphere shifting. One day the connection felt open. Then suddenly there was more silence. More delay. More guardedness. And because you did not have access to the conversations happening elsewhere, you naturally interpreted what you could see. But what you could see was only the surface. Beneath it, your soulmate was trying to answer a question that had nothing to do with whether you mattered. The question was whether they were brave enough to trust what they felt. Stay a little longer, because the next realization is where everything starts turning. The ex expected the doubts to make your soulmate forget you. Instead, something unexpected happened. Distance made certain memories clearer. Without constant interaction, your soulmate began noticing what was missing. They would experience something during the day and instinctively think of telling you. They would hear a phrase and remember something you once said. They would find themselves comparing the emotional ease they felt around you with the tension they had accepted elsewhere. Slowly, the uncertainty began transforming into clarity. Not dramatic clarity. Quiet clarity. The kind that arrives when nobody else is speaking and a person finally hears their own thoughts. And one particular thought kept returning. Why am I trying so hard to convince myself this connection means less than it feels? That question changed something. Your soulmate stopped seeing their feelings as a problem that needed to disappear and started seeing them as information. What were those feelings showing them about their needs? About their values? About the kind of relationship they wanted to build someday? The answer kept leading back toward qualities they associated with you. Warmth without pressure. Attention without control. Connection without pretending. That did not mean everything suddenly became simple. But it meant the ex could no longer rely on confusion alone. So another conversation happened, and this one went very differently. Your soulmate's ex asked why you were still being mentioned after so much time. Your soulmate did not avoid the question this time. There was a pause, then an admission so simple that it carried more weight than any dramatic declaration could have. They said they had tried to move past what they felt, but something about you still felt unfinished. Unfinished. That word mattered. Because unfinished does not necessarily mean someone is trapped in the past. Sometimes it means there is an honest conversation that never happened. A feeling that was never properly expressed. A possibility that was abandoned before anyone understood what it could become. And suddenly, the ex realized the thing they had been hoping would fade had instead become clearer. That is why the idea of you hearing the full story became uncomfortable. Because once you understand that your soulmate's distance may not have told the entire truth, you stop interpreting every silence as a final answer. You begin seeing the larger pattern. Still, there is one piece missing. One detail that even your soulmate did not realize had been kept from them. Something the ex knew about a message, something connected directly to you, that never reached your soulmate in the way it was supposed to. And when that detail finally comes forward, the question will no longer be why the ex wanted you to look away. The question will be what your soulmate does when they discover that one of the moments they thought meant nothing may have meant something completely different all along. The message was never supposed to become important. That is what makes this next part so difficult to ignore, because at the time it was sent, it looked ordinary enough to disappear among 100 other moments. There was no dramatic confession inside it, no demand for an answer, no attempt to pull your soulmate toward you. It was simply honest. A few words carrying more warmth than you probably realized, sent during a moment when your soulmate had been quietly wondering whether the connection between you was real or only something they had imagined. And somehow, what reached them was not the full meaning of what you intended. Maybe the timing became distorted. Maybe another conversation influenced how they interpreted it. Maybe someone close to the situation suggested that your words meant something completely different. What matters is that your soulmate walked away from that moment believing you had emotionally stepped back when, from your side, you may have been trying to show the opposite. Don't skip, because that misunderstanding became one of the invisible turning points in everything that followed. Your soulmate did not immediately ask you what you meant. They were too cautious by then. Instead, they carried their interpretation quietly, replaying the message whenever they felt tempted to move closer again. They told themselves, maybe I was reading too much into this. Maybe they were simply being kind. Maybe I should leave it alone. And every time those thoughts returned, the ex seemed to have another reason why distance was supposedly the wiser choice. Nothing extreme. Nothing obvious enough to create suspicion. Just subtle comments. Maybe they've moved on. Maybe they don't see you that way. Maybe reaching out will only complicate things. Small sentences can become powerful when they arrive at the exact moment someone is already doubting themselves. Your soulmate began listening to those doubts, not because they completely believed them, but because doubt sometimes feels safer than risking a vulnerable truth. Yet here is the part nobody expected. The more your soulmate tried to accept that explanation, the less convincing it became. Something inside them kept returning to the way you had actually behaved. Not the story others had created around you, but the real moments. Your patience. Your consistency. The times you showed care without making it transactional. The way you gave them space without turning cold. Those memories contradicted the idea that you had suddenly stopped caring. And slowly, your soulmate began wondering whether they had misunderstood something important. Stay till the end, because one question eventually pushed them toward a discovery the ex had hoped would remain buried beneath assumptions. It happened during another ordinary conversation. Someone who had been around during that earlier period casually mentioned that you had seemed confused by your soulmate's sudden distance. Your soulmate froze for a moment. Not because the statement was shocking, but because it did not fit the version of events they had been carrying. If you had truly wanted them gone, why would their distance have confused you? If you had lost interest, why had you apparently tried to understand what changed? That contradiction opened a door. And once your soulmate started looking through it, other details began changing shape. They remembered a time you reached out and they responded more cautiously than usual. They remembered how your tone seemed to soften rather than harden. They remembered a conversation they had ended too quickly because they were afraid of revealing how much your presence still affected them. And suddenly the question became unavoidable: what if both of you had been protecting yourselves from the exact same misunderstanding? What if you interpreted their retreat as disinterest while they interpreted your uncertainty as rejection? Think about how easily two people can stand only a few steps apart emotionally while believing the other has already walked away. Neither person needs to be dishonest for that to happen. Sometimes timing, fear of vulnerability, and outside opinions are enough to turn a simple conversation into months of unnecessary confusion. Your soulmate began seeing that possibility, and it unsettled the ex far more than any direct confrontation could have. Because the ex had grown comfortable with one assumption: as long as your soulmate believed you were no longer emotionally available, they would never risk finding out the truth. But now that assumption was weakening. Something important is waiting for you, because your soulmate did something next that nobody around them expected. They went back through the past, not obsessively, but carefully. They reread old conversations. They remembered exact moments. They compared what you actually said with what they had been told those words supposedly meant. And the difference was impossible to ignore. Where they had once seen hesitation, they now noticed patience. Where they had assumed emotional distance, they noticed restraint. Where they believed you were closing a door, they began seeing someone who may simply have been waiting for clarity. One message in particular stood out. It was something you had said almost casually, perhaps without realizing how deeply it would remain with them. You had communicated, in your own way, that you did not want to force anything, but you valued what existed between you. At the time, your soulmate focused on the absence of pressure and interpreted it as a lack of feeling. Now they saw the other half. You were respecting them. You were giving them room. And that realization touched something deeper than they expected. There is a difference between someone who disappears because they do not care and someone who steps back because they refuse to manipulate another person's choice. Your soulmate was finally beginning to understand that difference. The ex noticed the change almost immediately. Your soulmate became quieter around certain conversations but more certain inside themselves. They stopped asking for reassurance about whether forgetting you was the right thing to do. They stopped reacting when your name appeared. Instead, they listened. They observed. And sometimes silence does not mean a person has nothing to say. Sometimes it means they have stopped allowing everyone else to decide what they should think. That was the beginning of the real shift. One evening, the ex tried again. They reminded your soulmate of every reason the connection with you had supposedly been complicated. They mentioned timing, distance, misunderstandings, different expectations. All reasonable concerns on the surface. But instead of agreeing, your soulmate asked a question that changed the entire tone: how much of what I believe about them came from them, and how much came from everyone else? The room became quiet. That question was never supposed to be asked. Because once your soulmate separated your actual actions from other people's interpretations, the story became much simpler. You had not been perfect. Neither had they. There had been awkward moments, missed opportunities, and things neither of you knew how to say. But beneath all of that, there had also been something steady. Genuine interest. Emotional recognition. A connection neither time nor uncertainty had completely erased. And now your soulmate wanted to know why they had been encouraged to see it differently. Don't skip this moment, because the answer was not what they expected. The ex did not admit to some elaborate plan. There was no grand scheme. Instead, something much more human surfaced: insecurity. The ex had sensed that your soulmate felt differently around you. They had noticed the ease, the curiosity, the way your soulmate became more reflective after speaking with you. And rather than confronting their own feelings about that change, they began interpreting everything about you through the most doubtful possible lens. Your silence became indifference. Your patience became uncertainty. Your boundaries became distance. Your kindness became something supposedly ordinary. Not because those interpretations were necessarily true, but because believing them made the situation easier for the ex to emotionally manage. That is what they were hiding. Not a dramatic conspiracy. A pattern of interpretation shaped by fear of being replaced. And when your soulmate recognized that, anger was not the first emotion they felt. It was disappointment. Because they realized they had allowed someone else's insecurity to influence how they viewed a person who had never been given the chance to explain themselves. Stay a little longer, because what happened after that was even more revealing. Your soulmate did not immediately run toward you. They did something more mature. They questioned themselves. They asked why they had been so willing to believe the most uncertain interpretation. Why had they needed outside permission to trust their own experience with you? Why had they treated vulnerability like something dangerous instead of something that could simply be handled with honesty? Those questions were uncomfortable, but they were necessary. And slowly, your soulmate began taking responsibility for their own part in the distance. The ex may have influenced the story, but your soulmate had chosen not to ask you directly. They had chosen silence over clarification. They had allowed fear of an awkward conversation to become a much bigger separation. That realization mattered because it moved the story away from blame and toward growth. Your soulmate could no longer pretend that everything had happened to them. They now understood that if they ever wanted something genuine with you, or with anyone, they would have to communicate differently. They would have to stop making decisions based on imagined answers. And then came the detail that changed everything again. During that same period, your soulmate learned that there had been another message from you. One they had either overlooked, received at the wrong moment, or never fully understood. It was not romantic in some exaggerated way. It was something more powerful because it was simple. You had made it clear that you were not angry. You had not turned against them. You had simply assumed they needed space, and you respected that. When your soulmate heard this, they went completely still. Because for months, they had carried the belief that their hesitation had caused you to stop caring. In reality, their hesitation had caused you to become more careful. Those are very different things. Imagine realizing that the person you thought had closed the door may have been standing quietly on the other side, unwilling to push it open without being invited. That realization does not automatically fix everything. But it changes what is possible. Your soulmate began revisiting one question they had avoided for a long time: if they reached out honestly, not dramatically, not with promises, not expecting anything, would you be willing to hear them? The ex sensed that question forming, and that is when the request became more direct. They did not want you seeing the situation clearly because clarity removed the one thing keeping your soulmate frozen, the belief that too much damage had already been done. But the truth was becoming harder to hide. Nothing was completely ruined. Nothing had been decided forever. There was simply unfinished communication between two people who had both been trying not to get hurt. Something important is waiting for you, because your soulmate's next move was not a confession. It was preparation. They began mentally rehearsing what they would say if they ever had the opportunity to speak with you again. Not the perfect words. Honest words. I misunderstood you. I should have asked instead of assuming. I let other people's opinions become louder than my own experience. I don't know what happens from here, but I don't want the last chapter between us to be built on something that wasn't true. Those thoughts became harder to silence. And the more honestly your soulmate faced them, the less power the ex's interpretation held. But there is still one piece your soulmate has not discovered yet. One conversation that happened when they were not present. In that conversation, the ex admitted something about you to another person, something completely different from everything they had been telling your soulmate. And when those words eventually reach your soulmate, they may finally understand that even the person trying hardest to minimize your connection had recognized something real about you from the very beginning.